coal, and it's also dependent on the mechanization of the coal industry. And so I think that's what's putting people out of jobs.
Time.
And people are out of jobs, we can move on.
Thank you. We're about halfway, folks. Let's go to our next question. President Trump has proposed banning visitors and immigrants from several Muslim-majority nations, which 2 courts have struck down. What should Congress do when it comes to immigration from countries that pose potential threats to the United States? And Kathy Allen, you go first on this one. 90 seconds.
What should Congress do? I think there's already plenty being done. These people are vetted for years. And the people that are banned with the countries that Trump has proposed to be banned don't even make sense to me. They're not even where a lot of the terrorists who have attacked our country have come from. What about Saudi Arabia? You know, Osama bin Laden was born there. I just really have a problem with the ban in all respects. And if it was myself in Congress and there was any legislation proposed to make this kind of ban acceptable, I think it's inherently racist, and I would oppose it vehemently. I think we need paths to immigration that are reasonable, especially for children that were born in the United States. I favor the Dreamers Act, and I do not favor the rupture of families, as ICE is doing now. So if that legislation were to come before Congress as well, I would vote to be a more moderating influence and not try to repel people out of this country that have produced tax-paying revenue and that are peaceful, loving citizens.
Thank you. Carl Engwell, 90 seconds.
So I think that Utah has a very vibrant immigrant and refugee population. And we live in a wonderful state that is very accepting of people, that really values family values and community values. And I think that Utah seems to welcome folks from all over the world, refugees and immigrants, with open arms. And that is one thing that I personally love about Utah. So I would take those values to Congress and say that we appreciate the diversity and the vibrancy that immigrants and refugees bring to our communities.
Thank you. Ben Frank.
Awesome. I have a lot to say on this topic, so I'm going to try to speak quickly. First of all, I would say that the Trump administration the travel ban's not going to go through. That's pretty clear. But their argument for it, they were arguing against a straw man. They were arguing that we need some kind of vetting. Well, vetting already existed. As Kathy alluded to, the average time for a refugee to actually enter the United States after the vetting process was about 2 years. Secondly, let's look at these countries that we are banning or wanting to ban refugees from. Some of these countries, like Syria and Yemen, are facing the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. At least 7 million people are expected to starve to death in Yemen, and it is partially because of U.S. foreign policy supporting Saudi Arabia's blockade and selling more weapons to them. And so it's absolutely shameful that your foreign policy would be starving children to death, and then you would say that those children and their families can't come to the United States. And also with foreign policy, if we're interested in keeping the United States homeland safe, then we would be fighting the causes of terrorism. And the wars on terror, starting with Afghanistan and Iraq, have exacerbated the problem and have created the conditions for extremism all over the world.
So as a follow-up, are there any restrictive measures that Congress should consider to keep the United States safe?
I think the restrictive measures that had existed under the Obama administration with the vetting process that I had spoken about, where it took about 2 years for people to be able to come into the country for refugee status at all.
Kathy Allen.
Well, yes, when we find intelligence that we derive from our president, that there's some new plan to load weapons onto airplanes, we should take action to prevent terrorism, especially when the intelligence reveals specific targets that we can take action against. I think that's why we need a strong intelligence community. But I don't favor just random acts of legislation that are directed against people that have a certain religion. It's got to be something more objective than that. And I just wanted to say, too, that I happen to be the granddaughter of immigrants, refugees. I'm an Armenian. My grandparents came here to escape the genocide of the Armenians by the Turks. So I do know something about what it's like to come to America as a refugee and make a new life.
And Carl.
I think that the vetting process that we currently have, I'm going to kind of repeat Ben here, I apologize. We're not the same person, I promise. The vetting process that we have under the Obama administration has been doing it, I think, a wonderful job. And it's kind of odd to me, the quote-unquote travel ban is kind of odd to me in that it seems to pick and choose countries in the Middle East. I'm not sure what it accomplishes that we're not already accomplishing with what I think is already extreme vetting. 2 years is a long time.
Thank you. I want to linger on immigration just a little bit, only because it's been a quandary for Congress for many years. So immigration reform, there's a debate over piecemeal versus a holistic solution to immigration. What do you favor? Let's start with Kathy on this one.
Well, I think I
45
alluded
seconds.
to some of it earlier, that if you have families that have been here for many years and that have born children here, and you've been law-abiding, tax-paying, and contributing to society, I personally see no reason to expel you. This country was founded on immigrants. We are a melting pot. I like diversity. I like multiculturalism, and I don't feel threatened by them. So I'm not in any rush at all to expel people that have been here for years and are productive. I'm not in favor of building a wall. I'm in favor of building bridges. And as far as keeping people out that we don't want out, I think we've addressed that pretty thoroughly. Those people are vetted.
Time. Thank you. Carl?
Sure. Some stats that I like to look at are 75,000 of Utah's 1.44 million workers are undocumented. There are, in the agriculture industry, 1 of every 5 agriculture workers is undocumented. 1 of every 7 construction workers is undocumented. 1 of every 9 hospitality workers is undocumented. These are folks that are here wanting to live the same American dream that you and I would like to live. And I think that it is a tragedy that we are using ICE as a way to expel people from this country. There has been a 38% increase in deportations under President Trump, and a lot of those are non-criminal deportations. No human is a crime.
Thank you. And Ben, finally to you.
All right, thank you. So, I think there's one thing that is a large misconception, is that undocumented people are more likely to commit crimes than people born in the United States. However, there's several research institutions, including the Cato Institute, which leans right, that has shown that people that have been born in the United States are actually more likely to commit a crime. And I think that there's a lot of propaganda and misinformation that sells people on the idea that so-called illegal immigration is getting worse, where study after study shows that it's actually been in steady decline since 2009. As for the policies that I would like to see happen with immigration, first of all, I think that you're opening the door to racial profiling, Do they time?
I did.
Oh, that was short.
Again, you can reserve your time for your closing statement. Another question from Carbon County Democrats. President Trump's 2018 budget proposes cutting the Department of Transportation by 13% and eliminating all 15 Amtrak long-distance train routes, including the California Zephyr, which could affect small towns like Helper. So, what do you think about the transportation cuts that have been proposed? And Carl Ingwell, it's your turn to go first. 90 seconds.
Thank you. I will say that this might be another question where I'm a little bit unprepared as far as the transportation cuts to the California Zephyr it was called. So, this is another situation where I would have to talk to all stakeholders involved. In general, I am a firm proponent of money being used for infrastructure repairs, and a lot of the Department of Transportation goes towards infrastructure repairs. So using those monies to rebuild communities and revitalize communities like Helper, Utah, I think is important. So any of those budget cuts that would hurt small town Utah, I would be firmly opposed to.
Okay. Thank you. Ben Frank, you have 90 seconds.
So I oppose the budget cuts to the Department of Transportation, and for a couple of reasons. For one, Amtrak and public transportation programs help cut down on carbon emissions, and they help average consumers and workers find affordable means of traveling. Two, whenever we're talking about budget cuts for any department in the federal government, we're talking about job losses. And I think that this is one of many examples throughout Trump's budget plans of where we are willing to sacrifice jobs in the name of corporate profit. And what I mean by that is we're going to cut the Department of Education, cut the Department of Transportation, cut down the EPA, but then we're going to increase the already bloated military budget. And so I think that this is austerity in a really heinous way when we look at the environmental and job-cutting effects.
Thank you. Kathy Allen.
Well, I just want to know what happened to the plans for infrastructure that Trump promised, because he was going to build up our infrastructure, and you can't do that without money. I'm actually in favor of making transportation modernized with some of the newer technologies that I've read about in California, with very fast trains, very clean running trains. And I would like to see trains come to Helper, Utah, because I want to visit your art galleries. And I think it's, as Ben said, when you cut this kind of infrastructure, people become unemployed. And I thought that's what his whole message was about jobs. And it's time for the government to quit lying to the citizens and to tell the truth. You can't have it all. You can't have better infrastructure and tax cuts for everybody that are extreme. We need to get back to reality and planning, and it takes money and it takes time. And I'm not in favor of the education cuts, the transportation cuts, the cuts to health care, and the cuts to science funding. In fact, I find the whole budget perplexing.
Thank you. Let's move to our next question. Utah lawmakers passed a resolution this past session supporting a lawsuit against the federal government if the feds don't start handing over public lands to the state. So the question is, what is your position on Utah's plan to take land back from the federal government? And Ben, I believe it's your first opportunity, 90 seconds.
So I oppose the idea of the Utah government taking land back from the federal government, because ultimately I think that this goes back to my favorite subject, campaign finance reform. It has to do with there are people within our state government that are making a lot of campaign donations off of companies that will benefit from this, specifically oil companies. And we have to remember American history, and one of the greatest scandals in American history was the Teapot Dome scandal. And this is a way of, rather than using the Department of Interior, but using a state government to be doing the exact same things that obviously we weren't upset about Warren G. Harding doing, but maybe our grandparents or something.
All right. Thank you, Ben. Kathy Allen, 90 seconds.
Well, I always come back to the fact that you can't give back something that was never yours. And the federal lands were a condition of statehood. They've always been federal. They were never under state control. And I favor keeping them under federal control. I have actually a photo of a petroglyph in the Bears Ears that's shot through with rifle fire. And if that's an indication of how the state is going to care for public lands, then no thank you. I think that these lands, for instance, in Bears Ears, they deserve protection. And I think it's very disrespectful to the tribal peoples to go back on the agreement that these five tribes came together, put aside their own differences, and asked for this land to be protected. So I know that's a specific incident of what we're talking about, but it's very current, and it's an example of how these lands were never under federal control, and they need to be protected because they belong to all of us.
Thank you. And Carl Ingwell, 90 seconds.
Yeah, so Dr. Allen mentioned the Enabling Act, that when the state of Utah became a state, we handed over rights to federal public lands forever, as long as we are a state. So I believe that it is unconstitutional. It would be against our own state constitution to try and take these lands back. An independent study found that managing our public lands, this was by the state, found that managing our public lands is dependent on the price of oil and other fossil fuels. If the price of fossil fuels goes down, or there's some sort of bust that happens, we will not have the money to manage our then state-owned public lands. And so at that point, we would have to sell off the public lands to entities like oil and gas companies and other private interests. I'm firmly opposed to selling our public lands off. I believe that our public lands can be used as economic drivers for the state for generations and generations to come, as long as we use them smartly and sustainably.
Thank you. Kathy Allen, you mentioned Bears Ears, so I have to follow with that. Interior Secretary Zinke yesterday referred to the Antiquities Act as saying that there needs to be a better way to give local stakeholders a say in monument designation. Would you consider a legislative fix to the Antiquities Act, which gives presidents the power to designate a monument? And let's see, who goes first on this one? It is Ben. I'll give you a minute.
No, I wouldn't. I think that it's okay for the federal government and the executive branch to have that authority. And the reason is because in a state like Utah, where we have tremendous natural resources, and these areas such as Bears Ears that have been determined by the executive branch to be given monument status, that shouldn't be undermined by a state legislature, because it is a federal issue in so much as this land belongs to everybody, and the environment and climate change are important issues that the federal government needs to tackle. And so you're undermining how the federal government can tackle those issues if you are allowing their public lands to be bought off by any oil company that wants a piece of it.
Thank you. Kathy Allen, 1 minute.
I think there's quite a backstory to all of this that needs to be told. I expect you all know it already, but the claim that there was no public input into the formation of the Bears Ears has been proven false, actually, by the Tribune, who brought to light conversations between the governor's office and the Department of the Interior and exposed that there was plenty of input. So I would not favor a legislative solution because I don't see how the legislature of our country should have a say when local communities here really did come together and try to form this monument. And the fact that our local congressional delegation didn't listen is no excuse to abandon the Antiquities Act.
Thank you. And Carl Ingwell, 1 minute.
I think that the Antiquities Act works very well. The Antiquities Act is, let's not forget that all of our national parks in Utah started out as national monuments. These are parks that we all love and bring millions of dollars to the state every single year. Former Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, did her due diligence in the southern portion of Congressional District 3. She spent time, they spent months and years with stakeholders discussing Bears Ears National Monument. This is not something that was decided in 45 days like now Secretary Zinke is deciding. Furthermore, it is a tragedy that when Secretary Zinke came out, he virtually ignored the voice of the tribes. He met with the tribes in Salt Lake City for a little over an hour, and after that flew around conservative politicians from the state of Utah.
Time.
The monument was created for the tribes. They need to be listened to.
Thank you. Our next question, Kathy Allen, you will go first. Many on both sides of the aisle worry about Social Security's financial future. Do you believe there's a problem? And if so, what would you do to save Social Security? 90 seconds.
No, I don't believe there's a problem. All the data that I've looked at shows that it's solvent, and any problems with solvency that it does have are a result of the federal government borrowing the money and not paying it back. So I don't favor increasing retirement age at this point. I know during my lifetime it got changed for me from 65 to 66. I don't want it to keep going further and further away. And what needs to strengthen it is keeping people employed so that they're paying Social Security taxes. So we should be working to strengthen the needs of our millennial population by easing student debt and making sure that they're productive members of society.
Thank you. Carl Ingwell, 90 seconds.
Yeah, I think that, all of us pay into Social Security hoping that it will be there for us when the time comes. And so I think that we need to do everything to strengthen Social Security and look after people after their retirement age as we possibly can. There are many people in our society are underserved, and a large portion of elderly folks are not looked after like they should be. I think that we need to look into ways that we can better take care of those that have retired, elderly folks, and so on.
Thank you. And Ben Frank, 90 seconds.
So I think that the elephant in the room that hasn't been addressed as far as Social Security funding is the cap on taxable income. And obviously, you and I pay into Social Security. Why shouldn't we make the wealthiest people of our country do so? Like, for example, LeBron James, in the first half of the first game of any given season, makes enough money to where he doesn't have to pay into Social Security. And so, our departing Congressman Chaffetz was an example of somebody who wanted to privatize Social Security and change the retirement age to 69. But that's ridiculous because Social Security has been one of the most successful and beloved social programs in U.S. history, and the only problems with it are problems that are created by people that want to undercut it as a defense for doing so. We see this happen with Republicans in the government all the time. They say government never works, and then they make sure that they're elected, and that's exactly what they try to prove once in office.
All right. Our time is almost up for the debate portion. So we're going to move on to 1-minute closing statements. And again, according to the coin toss, Ben Frank, you're going to go first, and you've got 1 minute.
So you've heard 3 different visions for Utah's 3rd Congressional District and for America overall. And my vision is an America with a strong working class, is an America where we have New Deal economics, where we're moving away from corporations and towards the value of workers, and in America, a popular democracy. Because if we look through American history, history is not made by billionaires. It's not made by presidents or con men or anybody like that. History is made from social movements. It was a social movement that caused integration to happen in the South. It was a social movement that caused the women's suffrage amendment. And it'll be a social movement that gets money out of politics, that gets single-payer health care passed, and puts an end to these wars that have been going on since I was a kid.
Thank you. Kathy Allen?
I think what's needed the most in government right now is ethics and a return to the truth. We have to have facts. We have to have data-driven policies. We cannot make good policy based on extreme ideology. And I feel that science needs to be restored to its rightful place. Look at all the wonderful things it has given us, including anesthesia, antibiotics, space travel. All of these things are under threat by the current government, and I find that the lies are just omnipresent, and I would like to restore integrity to government, and that is one of the biggest reasons that I chose to run.
Thank you. And Carl Ingwell.
Thanks. And I'm very thankful to the Tribune for moderating this debate. I'm thankful to the City of Helper, Utah for hosting us, and the Carbon County Democrats that helped put this on. Thank you. So in the last couple hours, I've shown you why I believe that our campaign is best suited to move on to the general election. Having lived in both rural and urban areas of Congressional District 3, I understand the challenges and opportunities that these areas face. And I'll work tirelessly to protect our public lands from privatization, to provide universal health care for all Americans, and to work for more diverse rural and urban economies that allow everyone to take part. I think that it's vitally important that our party sends the best candidate forth, a candidate that can actually flip the third and set the stage for the midterm elections next year, and I am that candidate. Our campaign realizes that a vote is earned through strong platforms, experience, and dedication, and no amount of out-of-state campaign funds would make our campaign believe that we deserve to win without putting in the work. Let's flip the third. Thanks.
Thank you. Carl Ingwell, Kathy Allen, Ben Frank, thank you so much for the debate portion of our evening.